Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 393. In this bonus Mathoms episode of Do Not Be Hasty, we'll be looking back at what we missed from the Foreword and Prologue episodes. However, before we begin, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Stick 'em up, fellowship. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh. Amazing. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, Caitlin of Tea with Tolkien, John R., KG, and Earendel Hope. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in September of 2024, Alan C., Stephanie B., Dustin Q., and Robert S. Thank you so much for sticking with us over the years. Well, in this episode of Do Not Be Hasty, we'll take a look at some fascinating footnotes to the foreword and prologue of The Lord of the Rings. Like we did at the end of our journey through the very first chapter of The Lord of the Rings, this is kind of a catch-all for things that we missed, interesting little tidbits that we picked up along the way. And honestly, primarily, we're taking content in this case from the Reader's Companion, the Hammond and Skull Reader's Companion right here, if you're watching the video. Lot of fascinating stuff in here that these two scholars did an outstanding work by compiling this massive tome on this one book, The Lord of the Rings. And there's just no shortage of really fascinating background and tidbits and insights contained here. So I'm going to be picking out some of those from the sections that pertain to the foreword and the prologue that are of particular interest to me. But there's a lot more beyond that. So do yourself a favor and pick up a copy if you don't already have one. All right. So the first thing I wanted to note is with regard to the foreword, we'll run through some Mathoms from the foreword. This first one has to do with Tolkien's own opinion on what people found particularly attractive about this fictional world that he had written about. And this is found on, what is this page? It's Roman numerals. So Roman numeral 70, LXX, I believe that's the one. It says, on 20 September 1963, Tolkien wrote to Colonel Warkset, as at other times to other readers, part of the attraction of The Lord of the Rings is, I think, due to the glimpses of a large history in the background. An attraction like that of viewing far off an unvisited land or seeing the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist. And it goes on to say, the published Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, and History of Middle-earth document the large history referred to only in passing in The Lord of the Rings. So, this is something we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast, so really nothing new if you are a longtime listener. But it's just great to kind of hear Tolkien's own recognition of that idea that, readers, like many of us, just come back because there's this sense that like we're entering into this world that is just this vast world, and that even for all that we have that's been described about it, there's so much that we don't know, and our minds just kind of are drawn to that and want to, I guess, play around in that, if you will. So, nice little note there from Tolkien. Thought I'd start off with that one. The next one I'm picking out, the next Mathom I'm picking out here is a note from that pertains to this whole idea that the Silmarillion, Tolkien kind of, one of the things that drove him to create Lord of the Rings was this idea that the Silmarillion, as it stood in the late 30s, was not going to be published, right? But he still had a desire to like make parts of that world known. So I wanted to read this note here, which is found on Roman numeral 71. On 15 November 1937, Tolkien handed over to Stanley Unwin the Quinta Silmarillion, the Lay of Lithien, and other Silmarillion manuscripts among works to be considered for publication. The critic Edward Crankshaw was impressed with a prose version accompanying the poetic Lay of Lithien, the story of Beren and Luthien, despite eye-splitting names which he took to be Celtic. But neither this nor any of the other Silmarillion writings was of the sort that Allen and Unwin wanted from Tolkien to follow The Hobbit. The Quinta Silmarillion, in fact, was felt to be too peculiar and difficult even to be given to a publisher's reader. That says something, right? On 15 December, Stanley Unwin wrote to Tolkien that he thought that the Silmarillion contained plenty of wonderful material which might be mined to produce further books like The Hobbit, rather than a book in itself. That's that last part that really fascinates me. And I think, there's room. Now, In theory, I'm talking in theory here. I think there's room in theory for some of these stories that are told in shortened versions to be developed into much longer stories, right? Uh, a good example of that would be what was done with Turin Turambar, which became the Children of Hurin, um, and it's a pretty vast um, so it's a pretty vast story, um, and the version we have in the Silmarillion, the published version of the Silmarillion, is a short version of it. So um, I think it would be really interesting, and of course with Children of Hurin we get the long version, right? The novel length version. But you just think about all the stories that this could be done with. Now Tolkien is no longer around to do this for us, of course. But is it an impossibility? I mean, I wouldn't want just any like average Joe to be adapting this. I would be very particular about who does it. I'm not really sure that right now would be the time that I'd want to see it done, and maybe this means it won't ever happen in my lifetime. Uh, you know, so maybe it's a fool's errand. Maybe it's a foolish thought. I think for me, after seeing what what the corporate world with all of the money has done with this Rings of Power show. I'm not really sure I trust anybody out there that works for these big companies and adapting these sorts of things. But I don't know. Maybe one of these days, when it's all public domain, there will be people who are not really like working for some company, but who can just do it from an artistic perspective and really be true to what Tolkien, to the whole feel of what Tolkien wrote. Heck, if I'm still alive at that time, I might give it a shot myself for adapting some of these stories. But in theory, at least, I thought that was an interesting little take by Unwin there. That really you could he could see some of these stories being adapted into much longer novel length versions themselves. So I agree. I agree with him. All right. The next thing I wanted to look at, this will be maybe both a little bit fun but a little bit cringeworthy too, is looking at some of the bad reviews that are noted in here. So maybe we can just hate read some of the bad reviews that came out for the Lord of the Rings. These are found on pages Roman numerals 74 through 75. It says, although reviews of The Lord of the Rings on its first publication were mixed, they were mostly positive, some even enthusiastic, but a few were so remarkably negative as to suggest, as Tolkien obviously felt, that their writers had not read the book very carefully. Robert H. Flood felt that pretentious snobbery is the best description for this scholarly offshoot of a once-done fairy tale. It's the type of quaint thing that could well be a hoax to snare the hacks who would call it any more than a deadly overlong bore. Maurice Richardson of the New Statesman and Nation judged Tolkien to have a great deal of imagination, but of low potential. The various creatures, hobbits, elves, dwarves, orcs, ents, have no real individuality. Not one is a character. And though their dialogue is carefully varied from colloquial historical for men and wizards to prep school slang for hobbits and orcs, they all speak with the same flat, castrated voice. Prep school slang? What? I mean, seriously, what? What does that even mean? Most notoriously, the American critic Edmund Wilson wrote of The Lord of the Rings that there is a little in the book over the head of a 7-year-old child. It is essentially a children's book which has somehow got out of hand. It deals with the simple confrontation of the forces of evil with the forces of good, the remote and alien villain with the plucky little homegrown hero. Tolkien's poverty of imagination was so pathetic, Wilson felt, that to have critics such as C.S. Lewis, Naomi Mitchison, and Richard Hughes pay tribute to The Lord of the Rings in brief quotations printed on the original Allen and Unwin dust jackets could be explained only by the lifelong appetite that certain people, especially perhaps in Britain, have for juvenile trash. What a dummy. What a dummy. All right. I mean, seriously, how can you? That's all there is to it, right? I mean, it's pure snobbery, and it comes through in their comments. I mean, the comments just sound so absurd now to hear the kinds of things that folks like this are saying, and it just makes me happy that at the end of the day, Tolkien is Tolkien, and none of these people, we don't even know who any of them are, right? We do know who C.S. Lewis, and I'm not sure if I know who Naomi Mitchison is aside from the letters that Tolkien addresses to her. But anyway, you know, these, I mean, it's kind of just strange to hear people saying these things about Lord of the Rings. I mean, where do you get for like Lord of the Rings as juvenile trash? I don't fathom that. Even if you don't like it, I mean, it's one thing. There's plenty of people out there that I know that are not fans of Lord of the Rings, and that's fine. Like, if you don't like it, that's fine. But juvenile trash, like, I don't even understand where you get that. Like, I understand now what Tolkien thought, that a lot of these negative commentators hadn't even read the book, or just like skimmed it. So, that, I mean, what other explanation do you have? Which is, just, I don't know, not cool. Not cool to be putting, getting paid money to review something, and putting negative reviews out there about it, when you haven't actually even truly paid attention to it. Finally, Philip Toynbee, writing a few years later in The Observer, took a similar and particularly ill-considered line. Tolkien's Hobbit fantasies, he said, are dull, ill-written, whimsical, and childish. His more ardent supporters were then beginning to sell out their shares in him, and, most erroneously, The Lord of the Rings had already passed into a merciful oblivion. Well, that was completely wrong, right? Philip Toynbee, I think you've passed into a merciful oblivion, hopefully. I wish you and your legacy all of the best, in terms of long life and happiness and that sort of thing. But, I'm not really sure anybody knows who you are either. But Tolkien, people certainly know who he is, and people certainly know and love and revere Lord of the Rings. So I guess it's just everyone else in the world, these hundreds of millions of fans of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, who are the ones with really bad taste, and not you. So it's just, I don't know, knowing Tolkien's relationship with kind of the intellectual class, of which he was a part, but he was kind of, viewed himself as something of an outsider from. Knowing of his relationship here, it just makes these negative reviews all the more enjoyable to read, I guess you'd say. At the end of the day, he probably just realized, like, why do I care about impressing these people, right? You can see it really come through in on fairy stories, even in Leaf by Niggle. You can see it in Mythopoeia. You can see it come through in his essay on Beowulf. He was of a level, or perhaps even higher level than most of these folks intellectually, and academically, but he wasn't the snob that they were. I mean, I think that's really what it comes down to. I think there was a certain, like, Tolkien was never cool to them, right? Tolkien was never the art he was doing was never like, so like avant-garde and everything. Like, it's anyway, I could go on, but you guys get my drift. It's delightful to read these on a level, because you're just kind of like, Tolkien, who's laughing now, right? Like, Tolkien is Tolkien, and none of you are even close, right? So anyway, it's kind of some of these feel a little personal. They really do. But anyway, we'll leave that behind. All right. So moving on, a little bit more on Allegory. So one of Tolkien's kind of most famous sort of literary theory takes is his disdain for allegory. And I thought this note was interesting here, because he's not quite as blunt in his disdain for allegory here, and kind of explains, I think this maybe explains how he views it a little more. This is on page 76, Roman numeral 76. Of course, allegory and story converge, meeting somewhere in truth, so that the only perfectly consistent allegory is a real life, and the only fully intelligible story is an allegory. And one finds, even in imperfect human literature, that the better and more consistent an allegory is, the more easily it can be read just as a story. And the better and more closely woven a story is, the more easily can those so minded find allegory in it. But the two start from opposite ends. You can make the ring into an allegory of our own time if you like, an allegory of the inevitable fate that waits for all attempts to defeat evil power by power. But that is only because all power, magical or mechanical, does always so work. You cannot write a story about an apparently simple magic ring without that bursting in, if you really take the ring seriously, and make things happen that would happen if such things existed. Key phrase there, the better and more closely woven a story is, the more easily can those so minded find allegory in it, right? So what Tolkien is saying is like, look, to find allegorical meaning, you don't have to write an allegory, okay? You write a good story, and the allegory takes care of itself, right? It takes care of itself in the minds of the readers, because each reader brings their own experience and perspective to the story. And this is what he meant by the whole applicability thing, right? Don't write a story where it's like, here's my very obvious allegory, how this ring obviously stands for the atomic bomb, right? No, he writes a story about the dynamics of power and the trickiness of using power to overcome evil power, right? And all of the problems associated therein. And therefore it's applicable to pretty much everyone's life. Like, we can all find how the story of the ring kind of informs our own lives, in multiple ways. But if he comes out and it's like obvious that this is a, winking allegory for, symbol of the atomic bomb, that the ring is a winking symbol of the atomic bomb, then it's like, well, it's just about the atomic bomb, right? That's all. Maybe you can do more with it, but that's all there really seems to be to it, or at least it dominates the story, right? It dominates it in our minds, and it makes it harder to get over that. So I liked that Tolkien here just kind of explained his own perspective a little more clearly, and kind of got down to the underlying reasons that he doesn't like allegorical storytelling, I guess we could say, right? He's not against allegory in and of itself, but or like the effective allegory, but he's against kind of the deliberate allegory, if you will. All right. The last thing from the foreword we'll look at before we get to the prologue and my Mathoms on the prologue is a note about Sarehole Mill that we find on page 78 of the Roman numeral 78 of the foreword. So it says this: for a few years from 1896, Tolkien lived with his widowed mother and his brother in the hamlet of Sarehole, south of Birmingham, now part of the suburb of Hall Green. In September 1900, the family moved closer to the city, in part so that Tolkien would have less far to travel to school. In memory, Sarehole became an idyllic place and an inspiration for the Shire. In an interview for the Oxford Mail, Tolkien said to John Ezard, "I could draw you a map of every inch of Sarehole. I loved it with an intensity of love that was a kind of nostalgia reversed. There was an old mill that really did grind corn with 2 millers, a great big pond with swans on it, a sand pit, a wonderful dell with flowers, a few old-fashioned village houses, and further away a stream with another mill. It was a kind of lost paradise, and it was wonderful." But after a visit to Sarehole in September 1933, Tolkien wrote in his diary, I pass over the pangs to me of passing through Hall Green, becoming a huge tram-ridden, meaningless suburb where I actually lost my way, and eventually down what is left of beloved lanes of childhood and past the very gate of our cottage, now in the midst of a sea of new red brick. The old mill still stands, and Mrs. Hunt's still sticks out into the road as it turns uphill. But the crossing beyond the new fenced-in pool, where the Bluebell Lane ran down into the mill lane, is now a dangerous crossing alive with motors and red lights. The White Ogre's house has become a petrol station, and most of Short Avenue and the elms between it and the crossing have gone. How I envy those whose precious early scenery has not been exposed to such violent and peculiar hideous change. Tolkien had nicknamed the younger of the 2 men who operated the mill the White Ogre because of his white, dusty face. Hilary Tolkien recalled that in order to reach the place where he and his brother picked blackberries, they had to pass through the White Ogre's land, and he didn't like us very much because the path was very narrow through the field, and we traipsed off after corn cockles and other pretty things. The mill at Sarehole that Tolkien knew on Coalbank Road was built in the 1760s. Today it is the sole survivor of some 50 water mills that once operated in Birmingham. A branch of the city museums and art gallery, it is open to the public. In 1968, Tolkien subscribed to an appeal for its restoration. So I just wanted to share, do a little Google Maps and Wikipedia exploration here. This is the mill. This is the mill of Sarehole. You can go back to the map, and we can zoom out here on Google Maps, and you can see here Birmingham, kind of the larger the larger lay of the land when it comes to here's London and then here's Birmingham, just over the border really from maybe not quite over the border from Wales, but close, not too far from Wales. Then we zoom in and we can see, yes, south of Birmingham, here's this Sarehole Mill Museum. And we zoom in and we see there the mill pond. And this is the mill, which is now a mill museum. It says here the Shire Country Park right next to it. That's neat. I'm guessing this was named such as a tribute to Tolkien. Looking at some of these photos, just really pretty area. But we might understand how in Tolkien's time it had been very built over. Are those swans right there? Maybe. I think they're swans. Let's see here. They look like swans. Let's see here. So, but if I go back to the mill, here we go. And we can see the mill pond right next to it. So some different images. Looks like that's perhaps a carving meant to look something like Smaug, I'm guessing. Giant squirrel. There you go. Sarehole Mill, idyllic childhood haunt of J.R.R. Tolkien. So anyway, that's neat to see that it's become something of a tribute to Tolkien and to what it inspired in his imagination. Somebody created a little Hobbit door there. That's neat. So all of this very fun stuff, and it's nice to know that Tolkien may have had some influence on preserving this mill, and I think he would probably be happy to know that. All right. So let's move on to the prologue and some Mathoms from the prologue. All right. The first thing I found from the prologue that I found particularly interesting was this note on the word Hobbit, concerning the word Hobbit, right? So did Tolkien invent it? And this is kind of a little bit of a controversial topic. Tolkien thought he did, but later on, this is what he said in 1971. He wrote this to Roger Lancelyn Green of the Roger Lancelyn Green. He wrote this to him in regard to the Hobbit being considered for entry into the Oxford English Dictionary. Tolkien said, unsupported assertion that the claim that he invented the word Hobbit rested on unsupported assertion that I remember the occasion of its invention, and that I had not then any knowledge of Hobbardy, Hobbiti, Hobbardy Dick, etc. for house sprites, dialectical forms that had been called to his attention. The latter was also, in 1955, the title of a book by folklorist Catherine Briggs. And that my hobbits were in any case of wholly dissimilar sort, a diminutive branch of the human race. Also that the only English word that influenced the invention was whole. That granted the description of hobbits. The troll's use of rabbit was merely an obvious insult, of no more etymological significance than Thorin's insult in The Hobbit to Bilbo, descendant of rats. The OED subsequently defined Hobbit as a member of an imaginary race of half-sized people in stories by Tolkien, said by him to mean hole-dweller. A good overview of this question is provided by Donald O'Brien in On the Origin of the Name Hobbit in Mythlore, Volume 16, Number 2, Hole Number 60. In Appendix F, it is said that Hobbit was the name usually applied by the Shire folk to all their kind. Its origin was by the most forgotten. It seems, however, to have been at first a name given to the Harfoots by the Fallowhides in stores, and to be a worn-down form of Holbitla, hole builder. Also in Appendix F is an initial explanation of the word. Hobbit is an invention. In the Westron, the word used, when this people was referred to at all, was Banakil, halfling. But at this date, the folk of the Shire and of Bree used the word Kuduk, which was not found elsewhere. Meriadoc, however, actually records that the king of Rohan used the word Kuddukan, hole-dweller. Since, as has been noted, the Hobbits had once spoken a language closely related to that of the Rohirrim, it seems likely that Kuduk was a worn-down form of Kudukan. The latter I have translated by Holbitla, and Hobbit provides a word that might well be a worn-down form of Holbitla, if that name had occurred in our own ancient language. So there you go. Hobbit law. Hobbit law. Did Tolkien invent the word Hobbit? Probably, really, or very much popularized it. At least he did not knowingly borrow it from somewhere else. Is it possible that it was there in the leaf mold of his mind, as he might say, from other influences? Most certainly. But what creative things aren't, right? What creative things generally aren't? That's where I'll leave that. Also, found this particularly interesting note on the word Duero. So you might remember, we haven't really gotten here yet with our current reading, but there's this thing called the Duero Delf, which lies outside of Moria. And I've always thought that was an interesting word, Duero. Of course, you wonder, is it somehow associated with dwarves? And it turns out it is. On page 5 in the Reader's Companion, we find this. Here, as earlier in The Hobbit, Tolkien uses dwarves as the plural of dwarf. He acknowledged in correspondence that in English grammar the correct plural is dwarfs, but with an F. But philology suggests that dwaros would be the historical form, if developed from Old English dwaergas. The real answer is that I knew no better. Tolkien added a note about dwarves to The Hobbit with the Unwin Books edition of 1966 and inserted the following in Appendix F. It may be observed that in this book, as in The Hobbit, this form dwarves is used, although the dictionaries tell us that the plural form of dwarf is dwarfs, with an F. It should be dwaros or dweros if singular and plural had each gone its own way down the years, as have man and men, or goose and geese. But we no longer speak of a dwarf as often as we do of a man or even of a goose, and memories have not been fresh enough among men to keep hold of a special plural for a race now abandoned to folk tales, where at least a shadow of truth is preserved, or at last to nonsense stories in which they have become mere figures of fun. Tolkien does, however, use dwaro and dwarodelf, aka dwarf delving, to represent in English the name of Moria and the common speech. So there you go. That's where the word dwaro comes from. It's actually the Old English plural for dwarves, or at least it would be if things had followed appropriately. Anyway, that's where that word comes from. I don't know about you too, but I just feel like dwarves with the VES just seems so much more appropriate to the creatures, to the people in the Lord of the Rings, right? I mean, I can see, like, I think of like Disney Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, right? Like dwarfs, those are dwarfs with the F, right? Dwarves, like the hardy miners, delving deep down, right? Dwarves with the VS just sounds like that sounds like it's just like that V on there is like the axe, right? It's like the axe associated with the dwarves. So that is not a very etymological way of putting it, but I think Tolkien would still appreciate that way of looking at it. He was a big fan of, like, the quality of words, right? Like how they sound and how they come off. So I digress. All right. I like this description on page 8 of Tolkien's, how Tolkien described hobbits, how he envisioned them himself. He says, I picture a fairly human figure, not a kind of fairy rabbit, as some of my British reviewers seem to fancy. Fattish in the stomach, shortish in the leg. A round, jovial face, ears only slightly pointed and elvish, hair short and curling brown. The feet from the ankles down, covered with brown, hairy fur. Clothing, green velvet breeches, red or yellow waistcoat, brown or green jacket, gold or brass buttons, a dark green hood and cloak belonging to a dwarf, leathery soles, and well-brushed furry feet are a feature of essential hobbitness. Gotta have those well-brushed furry feet, right? Very, very important. So yeah, that's how Tolkien envisioned hobbits. So I think that's come with us, pretty well. I think that I don't think like Jackson's depictions of hobbits hasn't really deviated from that in any ways I can think of off the top of my head. All right, so also a note on Middle-earth and whether it's a fantasy world, right? Well, here's what Tolkien has to say about that. Middle-earth is not a special land or world or planet as too often supposed, though it is made plain in the prologue to The Lord of the Rings. Text and appendices that the story takes place on this earth and under skies in general the same is now visible. The sense is the inhabited lands of elves and men, envisaged as lying between the Western Sea and that of the Far East, only known by the West in the West by rumor. Middle-earth is a modern alteration of medieval Middle-Erde from Old English Midengard, Middle-earth, recorded in the Oxford English Dictionary back to 1275, is defined as the earth, or placed between heaven and hell, or as supposed to occupy the center of the universe. In the entry for Isengard in nomenclature, Tolkien indicates that the guard element, enclosure, appears in Old Norse garthur, and English garth beside genuine English yard. This, though usually of more lowly associations as English farmyard, appears, for example, in Old Norse Asgarthur, most widely known as Asgard in mythology. The word was early lost in German, except in Old English German Mitten or Mittelgart, Old English Mythgarthur, and Old English Middengard. So there you go, Middle-earth. It's just really this world, or a mythological way of referring to this world. All right. Next up, we have the meanings of Arnor and Gondor. What do those words actually mean? This is something I'd actually never considered, really. So on page 17 in the Reader's Companion, we learn Arnor is the name of the Númenórean northern realm, derived from Sindarin, Ar, which means high, noble, and royal, and Dor, which means land. So it means royal land or land of the king. Tolkien also said in 1972 that he retained Arnor because he desired to avoid Ardor, right? So Ardor, of course, has its own meaning, referring to a sound shift in the supposed later development of Sindarin. Gondor means stone land, is the name of the southern Númenórean kingdom in Middle-earth established by Isildur and Anarion. In his unfinished index, Tolkien describes Gondor as anciently including Kalinardan, later called Rohan, from Isengard to Entwash, Anorion between Entwash and the White Mountains, and all the land between west of Anduin from Rauros to River Erui, and Ithilien, the lands east of Anduin between the river and Efelduath, the mountains of shadow, as far south as River Poros. Also the faithful feasts of Lebanon, Belfalas, and Anfalas, west of Anduin and Cirith, between the White Mountains and the sea, and the lost fief of South Gondor between the river Poros and Harnan. At the time of this history, it included only Anorion and the faithful fiefs. Anyway, so there you go. Arnor, royal land. Gondor, stone land. Turns out the royal land didn't last nearly as long as the stone land. What does that mean? Interesting to think about. All right, next up are Marcho and Blanco. So you might remember Marcho and Blanco were the two fallowhides that were really the founders of the Shire, right? They were the founders of the Shire. It turns out they are, these two names are kind of Tolkien's wink to the Germanic figures that were really, they were kind of the first Englishmen, if you will. So here's what it says. The names of the Fallowhide brothers, and this is on page 19 in the Reader's Companion, the names of the Fallowhide brothers who, with a great following of hobbits, colonized the Shire are a deliberate parallel to those of Hengist and Horsa, two Germanic chieftains who came to Britain with their warriors in the early 5th century, first of the Anglo-Saxons who eventually conquered the native Britons. Hengest is Old English for gelding, horse, steed, and Horsa stems from Old English horse, which Marcho is derived from Old English mare, horse, steed, compare Welsh march, horse stallion, marchog, rider, and Blanca is Old English for white or gray horse. So there's the parallel right there. So all of this is to say, right, that really the Shire is just supposed to be England, right? It's supposed to be rural England, really. We'll come back to that here in just a second. Angmar. What does Angmar mean? So Angmar was an ancient kingdom in the far north of Middle-earth, ruled by the Witch King, afterwards the chief of the Nazgul. Its name is derived from Sindarin Ang, which is iron, and Quenya, Mar, which is home. In the manuscript of nomenclature, Tolkien notes that the name and origin of the Witch King is not recorded, but he was probably, like the lieutenant of Barad-dûr, the mouth of Sauron, of Númenórean descent. Angmar seems to be corrupt Sindarin or Quenya. Pure Sindarin would be Angbar, Quenya Angamar. The Witch Lord, or Witch King of Angmar, was the greatest of the 9 men to whom Sauron gave rings of power, and thus perverted them. Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their days, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. He became chief of the ring wraiths. the use of which in his title seems odd to contemporary eyes, to whom the word is popularly associated only with females. But its oldest use, recorded in the Oxford English Dictionary, is a man who practices witchcraft or magic, a magician, sorcerer, wizard, and for most of its history it belonged to no gender. In Third Age, 1974, the Witch King and his forces took Fornost, but in 1975 he was defeated in a great battle, the last battle, against the host of the West, and vanished from the north, escaping to Mordor. So, Angmar, of course, means iron home. Iron home. There you go. All right. So on to the Shire. If we drop the fiction, Tolkien said to Rainer Unwin in 1956, if we drop the fiction of long ago, the Shire is based on rural England and not any other country in the world. The toponymy, place names of the Shire, is a parody of that of rural England, in which the same sense as are its inhabitants. They go together and are meant to. After all, the book is English and by an Englishman. Elsewhere he commented that the Shire is more or less a rural Warwickshire village of about the time of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. So, we've talked about this. I think we talked about this in our, in some episodes of the very first chapter of A Long Expected Party. It's kind of this weird little note because everything is so like of the world of this time, particular, ancient time period. And then all of a sudden you have like this people of more or less Victorian English, rural English culture just kind of show up in the middle of it all and become the main characters. So Tolkien was just kind of like, it is what it is, right? That's kind of what happens when you when the publisher says, hey, I want a sequel to The Hobbit, and you're like, well, I really want the Silmarillion written, so what I'll do is I'll give you a sequel to The Hobbit that's really a story of the Silmarillion, right, within the world of the Silmarillion. Clever Tolkien. All right, we're going to jump ahead a little bit to what the word Shirriff means. Now, I'm always tickled by this word, right? I always see this word Shirriff, Shirriff. Of course, it means sheriff. But like it's just a funny little. It just seems like kind of a funny little Hobbitism, right? They call them the Shirriff. But I had not put two and two together on this, but it turns out Shirriff is actually a now obsolete form of English sheriff, meaning shire officer, used by me to make the connection with Shire plainer. In the story, it and Shire are supposed to be special Hobbit words not generally current in the common speech of the time, and so derived from their former language related to that of the Rohirrim. English sheriff is derived from Shire Reeve, i.e. the reeve or local official of the Shire. So I just think that's really interesting because it turns out all this time that the word sheriff, which most of us in different places we live in, probably official, like, known as the sheriff, who's the chief law enforcement official for the area. The sheriff, that word comes from one of the roots is Shire, right? That's a very cool little connection there that I had never made before. So that's the kind of insight you get on the Tolkien Road podcast, people. That's what we're here for. Of course, that comes from the Reader's Companion here for The Lord of the Rings. So make sure and go pick yourself up a copy. All right, couple more here. So as far as the change of Bilbo's story, we've talked about this quite a bit, right? His story of how he came into possession of the ring. The kind of historical development of that, there's a long note on this, but I'll just read a short portion of it. It says, Tolkien wrote to Unwin, I have decided to accept the existence of both versions of Chapter 5 so far as the sequel goes, meaning The Hobbit Chapter 5 so far as Lord of the Rings goes. His final solution was brilliant, that the ring at once began to assert control over Bilbo so that he lied about how he obtained it in order to strengthen his claim to ownership, and that it was this false account that Bilbo set down in his memoirs, and he seems never to have altered it himself, not even after the Council of Elrond. Evidently, it still appeared in the original Red Book, as it did in several of the copies and abstracts. So, the reason behind that change in Bilbo's story is, of course, because Tolkien needed a better, kind of a better explanation for his story, for how Bilbo came into possession of it, for the sake of Lord of the Rings. But it just so happened to work out to make the kind of the lore that much more interesting, right? The lore that much more interesting to be able to say that, well, actually Bilbo changed the story because he was under the influence of the ring. So you just got to appreciate how Tolkien handled that, right? Very, very clever. A lot of fun from a writer perspective. Right below that, there's this note on the name Samwise. Did not know this. The name Samwise, Sam Gamgee, is a modernization of Old English Samwise, which means half-wise or simple. Poor Sam, his name means half-wise or simple. Of course, now we probably, Sam and his character have redeemed the word Samwise to probably meaning somebody who is simple, but who is nevertheless very heroic and perhaps wiser than he gets credit for. And it's interesting how that maybe happened. So, in a few hundred years, the word Samwise might actually mean more what I just said, right? Because of this particular character. And finally, let's look at Elrond's name. Elrond. In 1958, Tolkien wrote to Rona Bear concerning the etymology of the name Elrond. Elrond was a primitive Elvish word for cavern. Nargothrond, Elrond and Elros, children of Eärendil, Sea Lover, and Elfwing, Elffoam, were so called because they were carried off by the sons of Feanor in the last act of the feud between the high elven houses of the Noldorian princes concerning the Silmarils. The Silmaril, rescued from Morgoth by Beren and Luthien and given to King Thingol, Elwë, Luthien's father, had descended to Elwing, daughter of Dior, son of Luthien. The infants were not slain, but left like babies in the wood, in a cave where with a fall of water over the entrance. There they were found, Elrond within the cave, and Elros dabbling in the water. But in later writings, Tolkien said that Elrond meant star dome, from El star plus rond, hall or chamber with vaulted or arched roof. That Elrond was a word for the firmament, the starry dome as it appeared like a roof to Arda, and it was given by Elwing in memory of the great hall of the throne of Elwë in the midst of his stronghold of Menegroth that was called the Menelrond, Elwë, of course, being Thingol. And that the names Elros and Elrond were formed to recall the name of their mother Elwing. So there you go. Elrond really means starry dome. It's a reference to the sky and to the beauty of the stars, but also to this great hall in Menegroth. So an interesting note to finish things off with there. All right, well, as with all things Tolkien, the details here are tremendous and full of endless fascinations. In the next episode, we'll look at the correspondence I received from you guys for these episodes. I can't wait to see what amazing insights and questions this fellowship brought to the table. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider supporting us in one or all of the following ways. First, join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/Tolkien Road. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and lends you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/Tolkien Road. Second, if you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. To close, as always, we'd like to thank our amazing fellowship. We know all of you half as well as we should like, and we've thanked less than half of you half as well as you deserve. Special thanks to the following: John R., Caitlin of Tea with Tolkien, KG, Eärendil Hope, Emilio P., Jonathan D., Richard K., Paul D., Julia, Wordy, Chris B., 2R91, Carolyn S., Emil K., Brian O. II, Jonathan R., Matthew W., Daniel D., Harrison C., Jason C., Seb M., Wilbo Baggins, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T., Redhawk, Shannon S., Brian O. the First, Zeke F., James L., Chris L., Aja V., Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C., David of Pints with Jack, and Eric B. Finally, thanks to all for watching and or listening. Until next time, the road goes ever on. Bye-bye, everybody.